Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So for the next little while, at least, I'll be doing analysis on the very hefty Playtest 6. And that means, unfortunately, there is little chance I'm going to finish before the survey for this playtest is opened, or potentially even before it's closed. So I will at least make sure to do a video going over my responses in the survey before that window closes for anyone interested in my feedback to Wizards of the Coast. Now, last week, I released a couple videos in collaboration with Colby from D4 Deep Dive going over the playtest Monk. Easily, that was my biggest disappointment of this entire playtest. And not just playtest 6, but I mean all the playtests up to now. So I am actually relieved to have that out of the way. So now I can focus on some more promising stuff. So in this video, I'm going to go over the Rogue, which is one of those promising things. I wanted to discuss the changes as well as optimization potential for this version of the Rogue, talk a little bit about damage. I wasn't happy with the first version of the Rogue that we saw, and up to the Monk, it was the class I was least excited for. I'm pleased to say this new version of the Rogue class is actually something I'm excited to try out. Though there are still opportunities for improvement, of course there are. This redesign does have me cautiously optimistic we could have a Rogue in the 2024 Player's Handbook that is a lot more interesting to play than the Rogue we've been playing for the last 9 years. So I'm going to go over this document first. I'm going to highlight any changes, both to the last playtest as well as to the 2014 Rogue. I'm going to discuss those changes, and then I'm going to go over some ways I think builds could make use of this Rogue class and do some damage calculations. So to start out, hit points, proficiencies, the scaling of sneak attack, that's all remain the same as the previous playtest. And the only significant change from the 2014 Rogue is weapon proficiencies. This Rogue has proficiency with all simple weapons and martial weapons with the finesse property. And those are the short sword, the scimitar, the rapier, and the whip. At first level, we get expertise, sneak attack, thieves' cant, and weapon mastery. So expertise is double proficiency in any two of your skill proficiencies. And I'm still kind of curious how the rules for using tools are going to shake out, because Thieves' Tools expertise was an option with the 2014 Rogue, and it's not an option here. And I wonder if you'll be using a skill proficiency for Thieves' Tools. Is that the reason it's been excluded here? Or whether it's going to be its own kind of check, and if so, I'm not sure why it's been excluded here. I am very happy to say that sneak attack has been restored to the 2014 version, where you can sneak attack once per turn. In the expert classes playtest, they had changed this so you could only sneak attack on your turn. And clearly this was not popular with the community, so they have dispensed with that. Now there are some tricks you can use to sneak attack more than once per round, and those are restored. But more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, you can now hold your action and deliver a sneak attack with a held action off turn reaction, which is something I really felt a Rogue should be able to do. So I am relieved to see they backed off on that restriction. And I wouldn't call this a buff to the Rogue. It's more like the removal of an unnecessary nerf. Either way, good. Thieves' Cant remains the same ribbon feature that it has always been. And then we have Weapon Mastery, which is new on the Rogue. And when we saw Weapon Mastery in Playtest 5, I know a lot of us were wondering, is the Rogue going to be able to use Weapon Mastery, or are they going to need to take a 4th level feat in order to use it? And now we have our answer. Yes, they're going to get it. The Rogue gets to pick 2 weapons for which they have proficiency, and access the Mastery properties, and they can switch those out after a long rest. Should you pick up weapon proficiency through some other means, you should be able to select that weapon's mastery as one of these options. But assuming you just have the Rogue's weapon proficiencies, and you want to use dexterity for attacks, this will limit your mastery options quite a bit. So when we look at the weapon mastery options that the Barbarian has or the Fighter has, the Rogue just doesn't have that many options. Basically, you're choosing between Nick, Slow, or Vex. I guess personally I would think that Nick or Vex would be the masteries that a Rogue is likely to gravitate to, and you have several weapon options for either one. Now, if you do pick up heavy crossbow proficiency somehow, then push could be another option that uses dexterity and could be combined with sneak attack. Now, with rogues, paladins, rangers, even war clerics are getting weapon mastery now, warlocks with the blade pact seem even more excluded than ever. So I am really hoping that with the next Warlock release, we'll see Weapon Mastery added to Blade Pack Warlocks. Then they could probably just not bother with that Weapon Mastery feat at all. Regardless, adding Weapon Mastery to the Rogue, that is a significant buff. Second level gives us Cutting Action, no change here, and I've always been a fan of this feature, so I'm glad they aren't messing with it. And then at third level, the Rogue is going to get a subclass and get Steady Aim. We know the subclass options for the Rogue will be the Arcane Trickster, the Assassin, the Swashbuckler, and the Thief. And I'm pretty happy with the 4 subclasses they decided to include. This provides a fairly eclectic mix of subclass options, and I will go over all those subclasses after I go over the base class, and I think they did a pretty good job with them overall. And Steady Aim, the optional class feature from Tasha's, is now a part of the base Rogue class at the same level. I like this feature, and I'm glad it has been added here. This was apparently added due to survey feedback, so if you asked for it, you deserve to pat yourself on the back. Good job. Now, a lot of us have been playing with Steady Aim for years already, but in regards to the base class, adding it as a base feature, it's another buff. At 5th level, you get 2 features, the brand new and shiny Cunning Strike, and the old standby Uncanny Dodge. So Cunning Strike was a very pleasant surprise, because I had gotten the impression that they were basically done with experimenting with big new ideas for the base classes, and what we would see in this playtest was largely going to be a reversion to what we had seen in the 2014 classes, well, holding on to new ideas that had been popular in the previous playtests. I think Jeremy Crawford actually implied that very heavily in one of his interviews. But here is a brand new Rogue feature, hooray! And from what I've seen online, the reaction to this has been very positive. So Cunning Strike starts us down a road that continues at later levels in the base class and is also expanded in all of the subclasses, where the Rogue can treat their sneak attack dice like a resource. They can use those dice for damage, as normal, or for some other effect. So at level 5, we're going to start out with 4 additional options. Here's how it works. So you hit a creature with an attack that qualifies for sneak attack. So you can either just deliver the sneak attack damage, as normal, or you can sacrifice one of those sneak attack dice for some other effect. At higher levels, you can sacrifice more dice, we'll get into that, but at level 5, 1 die is the most you can sacrifice. So you can choose one of these options with each sneak attack hit. Most of these effects provide a saving throw, and the DC is based on the Rogue's dexterity modifier. Disarm provides a dexterity saving throw, or the Rogue chooses one item the target is holding, which is then dropped. Poison provides a constitution saving throw, or the target is poisoned for up to a minute, getting an additional saving throw at the end of each of its turns. This one requires you have a poisoner's kit in your equipment, but you don't need to have it out or available, and you don't even need to be proficient in it. So just get yourself a poisoner's kit, throw it in your backpack, forget it. Trip provides a dexterity saving throw, or the target falls prone if it's large size or smaller. And Withdraw allows you to move half your speed without provoking opportunity attacks immediately after the attack. And this is bonus movement. So if I hit a creature with an attack that qualifies for sneak attack, and I have 3d6 sneak attack, and then I choose one of these options, I'm still delivering 2d6 sneak attack damage, and I get one of these additional effects. Now, one concern that I have been asked about is whether the Rogue, who, at least in the 2014 rule set, is on the lower side of damage potential as far as weapon users goes, whether they can afford to give up any of their sneak attack damage. As far as I'm concerned, and I'll go into more details on this later and show some math, the Rogue's damage potential is much higher than ever. So choosing one of these options, it shouldn't take you into irrelevant damage territory, and these are just more options. And I figure that's a good thing. I don't know that I would always choose to do one of these things when I hit with a sneak attack. Sometimes I'm going to be perfectly fine just doing damage. But having these available for times when they are appropriate is a pretty nice buff, as far as I'm concerned. But it's not just that making the Rogue more powerful is a buff and that's good. It also addresses one of my chief complaints about classes like the Rogue, and that is that it tends to be a case of attack, do damage, attack, do damage, the same thing over and over and over, and I wanted more options for the Rogue and the Fighter and the Barbarian to do different things. Weapon Mastery is one method that these classes get more options, and Cunning Strike is yet another. And since this can be combined with weapon mastery, things like combining slow mastery with trip, cunning strike could lead to combinations that are even more effective. Or even withdraw plus nick plus cunning action. And I am pretty happy with this as presented. I even think these are all viable options in the right scenarios. So I'm even fairly satisfied with the balance right out of the gate. And that's usually not the case. Even when I'm excited about new features, they're usually not perfectly balanced. Like weapon mastery, for example, is not perfectly balanced at this point. It needs some refining, even though I love weapon mastery. So I think this is a big win, and I am thrilled with it. And Uncanny Dodge is unchanged. And I am relieved they didn't use Cunning Strike, as it just occurred to me that rhymes with Stunning Strike, and I'm going to get those confused, as an excuse to remove Uncanny Dodge. Uncanny Dodge is an important defense for the traditionally weak armor class rogue, so although I don't have much to say about it, I'll just say I'm glad it's still here, I'm glad it's unchanged. At 6th level, the rogue will get expertise and 2 more skill proficiencies. This is a bit earlier than the last playtest where it was level 7, but it is the same as the 2014 rogue. At level 7, again, the rogue is going to get 2 features. Evasion, which is basically the same as the 2014 rogue, except it can't be used when the rogue is incapacitated now, which, makes sense. And in the last version of the playtest rogue, you had to wait until level 9 for evasion, which seemed really late. So I'm very glad to see it restored to 7th level. And another surprise, Reliable Talent was previously 11th level for both the previous playtest version and the 2014 rogue, is now gained significantly earlier, 7th level. Mechanically, it's basically the same feature. Whenever you make an ability check that uses a skill or tool proficiency, you treat any roll of 9 or lower on the d20 as a 10. The wording change here does shore up a couple little exploits that you might not be aware of. For example, with the 2014 rogue, where the wording says, whenever you make an ability check where you add your proficiency bonus, that meant something like a Heron Gone, which adds its proficiency bonus to initiative, which is an ability check. You could have Reliable Talent apply to that. So these kinds of exploits are closed, but for 99% of players, this is going to be mechanically the same feature, just much, much earlier. This is yet another big buff for the rogue, and I think I like this. Reliable Talent being 11th level meant you didn't see it very often, even for straight class rogues. And it's still high enough of a level that you aren't dipping rogue to get this. 7 levels is still a deep investment in rogue, so I think I'm good with this. And at 8th level, ability score increase, and at 9th level, a subclass feature, and then at level 10, the rogue gets their extra ability score increase. This one always feels really nice. Then at level 11, the rogue now gets Improved Cunning Strike. This allows the rogue to use 2 Cunning Strikes on the same attack, and depending on your subclass, you may have gotten some new Cunning Strike options. Now, it's not free. If you want 2 additional effects, you have to pay for both of them. But you also have a bigger sneak attack pool. Since Cunning Strike was gained, our dice pool has doubled from 3d6 to 6d6. So, as a ratio of your total sneak attack damage, 2 1d6 effects is the same cost as 1d6 was at level 5. Now, even at this point, I'm not necessarily going to want to put any Cunning Strike options on my sneak attack, never mind 2 of them. But having that option does provide additional tactical options, so I'm glad for that. Then there's an ability score increase at 12, subclass feature at 13th, and I should mention the other rogue had a feature at 13th called Subtle Strikes that essentially gave them like pack tactics, which was a way to get advantage. So this rogue does lose out on that, and that's technically a nerf, though I will say that since we got Steady Aim at level 3, Subtle Strikes wouldn't have felt all that different at level 13, so I'm fine with losing it. And at 14th level, we get some more potent Cunning Strike options with Devious Strikes. Daze costs 2 dice and provides a Constitution saving throw where the target is dazed until the end of its next turn. Knockout costs 6 dice, so that's actually most of our dice, and the target must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or be rendered unconscious. This could theoretically last a minute, but the target gets an additional saving throw at the end of each of its turns to end the effect, and if it takes any damage, it automatically ends the effect. And Obscure costs 3 dice, and the target makes a dexterity saving throw or is blinded until the end of its next turn. Now I have to say, I don't know how often I would use Knockout. That 66 damage to potentially coax 1 legendary resistance. That is a really high cost for something that probably isn't going to do anything. An Obscure 3d6 seems a bit high to me. I think maybe it should be 2d6. So I do think there is a bit of refinement needed here, but there are cool ideas. And I could definitely see going for the Daze effect. I mean, it would probably coax the same legendary resistance that Knockout would on a failed Constitution save, at a third of the cost of Knockout. Slippery Mind is the same as the last playtest, and a bit better than the 2014 Rogue, which doesn't get the Charisma saving throw proficiency, so that's a buff. And as we can see, the Rogue buff column is getting pretty fat at this point. Then ability score increase at 16, subclass feature at 17, elusive at 18th, it was 17th in last playtest, and it ensures no attack has advantage against you unless you're incapacitated. Then at 19th level, there's an ability score increase, and I'll just note here that the ability score increase feat now specifies that if you are level 19 or higher, you can raise your score up to 22. So I imagine that's the play here. Dexterity 22, level 19, great. One more to the buff column. Then at level 20, Stroke of Luck, it was 18th level in the last playtest, and it had the buff that instead of changing the roll to a success, it now changes it to a nat 20. Meaning if it's an attack roll, that's a guaranteed critical hit, which is especially nice when you have 10 sneak attack dice doubling. And one final buff to the base rogue. And I guess I should add no epic boon to the nerf list, and this is our final list of nerfs and buffs of this rogue. And I almost wonder whether it's even worth putting the nerfs here, because those aren't nerfs to the 2014 rogue. The 2014 rogue didn't have subtle strikes or an epic boon. So when it is compared to our 2014 rogue, the rogue we've been playing for 9 years, only buffs. Weapon mastery buff. Steady aim as part of the base class is a buff for some players, not for everyone. Cutting strike is a buff. Reliable talent at 7th is a buff. Improved cutting strike is a buff. Devious strikes is a buff. Slippery mind adding charisma saves is a buff. Being able to increase your dexterity to 22 at 19th is a buff. And getting a nat 20 with Stroke of Luck is a buff. In fact, that's 9 buffs compared to the 2014 rogue. But here's hidden buff number 10, is that this rogue also has a much better relationship with feats. So we know that, the fighter had a good relationship with combat feats. Now the rogue does too. So really 10 buffs compared to the 2014 rogue. This is just a much, much superior rogue, both mechanically, but I also think the play is going to be a lot better as well because you have so many more cool things you can do with it. So the base rogue did very, very well. Let's look at the subclasses and then do a bit of quick overall analysis. So we're going to start with the Arcane Trickster. I think this is generally considered one of the best, if not the best, rogue subclass. There's a few changes here, and guess what? Yep, they're buffs. So let's start with spellcasting. So starting with this prepared spells column, it is not really a buff or a nerf, but it is a bit of a lateral move. The scaling of prepared spells is slightly different than the 2014 version. At some levels, this is a bit of an improvement, and at other levels, it's a bit worse. But with the exception of level 20, it's like 1 preparation, gained or lost. Close enough that I consider it a wash. The Arcane Trickster can now use an Arcane Focus, which is fine. Not really a big deal. I would normally use a component pouch anyways. The buff here, which is pretty big, is the easing of restriction to spell schools. It's eased so much, in fact, I wonder if there's any point in having it at all. So the old Arcane Trickster, most of your spells needed to be wizard spells of the enchantment or illusion school. You got 1 exception at level 1, then 1 more at level 8, 14th, and 20th level. So if you have a 20th level Arcane Trickster, 4 of your spells over 20 levels didn't need to be illusion or enchantment. With this playtest, at 3rd level you choose 3 arcane spells of your choice, 2 of which need to be illusion or enchantment, and then that's it. After that, pick any arcane spell of a level you can cast. But more than that, you can switch out your spells whenever you gain a level. and there is no restriction for that. So at levels 4 and 5, you could just switch out your enchantment or illusion spells that you picked at 3rd level, and then you don't need to have any enchantment or illusion spells if you don't want them. Maybe that's not intentional. Maybe there's going to be wording preventing switching those spells to non-illusion or enchantment spells in future playtests or the 2024 Player's Handbook. But at least for now, the restriction seems to be basically irrelevant by the time you get to 5th level. You also get Mage Hand Legerdemain at level 3, and the wording here is far more simple than it was before, but ultimately, you can do the same things as always. So better wording, same feature, great. At level 9, you get Magical Ambush, which is also different wording, but ultimately the same. It says you need to have the invisible condition now, but you get that condition when you're hidden, so it works the same as it always has. Then at 13th level, we get Versatile Trickster, which is totally changed. The old version gave you advantage to attack a creature as a bonus action as long as you had your mage hand next to the target. And this was a deceptively difficult feature to use since you probably needed that bonus action to move the hand in the first place. And arguably, it wasn't really a big deal anymore since Steady Aim made advantage as a bonus action really, really reliable. So now, if you use the disarm or trip options from Cunning Strike, you can also target a creature within 5 feet of your mage hand. Now, I notice you don't even need to qualify for a sneak attack against a second creature. So let's say you're hidden, or you have an ally next to your target, you use your bonus action to move the hand into position, and then that second target doesn't need to be anywhere near the initial target. And then you double up your disarm or trip Cunning Strike. Pretty good. And I would consider it a buff over the old Arcane Trickster. Then Spell Thief at 17th level is the same as it was before. So the Arcane Trickster was always a pretty good subclass, but as far as I'm concerned, this one is improved. Next up, the Assassin. At 3rd level, you get proficiency in the Disguise and Poisoner's Kit, no change there. And then Assassinate at level 3 has changed pretty significantly. The 2014 version gave you advantage on attacks against a creature that hadn't taken a turn in combat yet. And if you hit a creature that was surprised, it was automatically a critical hit. So much of the value of that feature depended on the frequency of surprise. And that can change from table to table as well as from session to session. And arguably, when you get surprise, is the point where you really don't need the extra damage because surprise is so good. This playtest version gives you advantage on your initiative check and then gives you advantage on attack rolls against creatures that haven't taken a turn yet in the first round. Furthermore, if you deliver a sneak attack on round 1, whether you went before the target or not, you add your rogue level to the damage. I like this one way more. This is going to be far more reliable than the old version. Surprise is no longer necessary for the damage boost, and heck, you don't even need to win initiative for the damage boost. And if you do get an additional sneak attack on round 1 with a reaction or whatever, you can get multiple instances of the extra damage. And advantage on the initiative check also increases your odds of advantage on the attacks. There are absolutely rare circumstances and builds that can use the old version to deliver more damage than this version, but I gotta think 90% of the time, this version is going to be the better of the two. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a buff, and I am a fan. Now 9th level is where the old Assassin really became a letdown. Infiltration expertise was so circumstantial and required a week of downtime to even set up. Now, infiltration expertise is basically the old 13th level imposter feature. There's a bit of cleanup with the setup time, and it's probably slightly better. It's still pretty circumstantial though, but compared to the old 9th level feature, definitely a buff. Then at 13th level, we get a brand new feature, Envenom Weapons. This is the kind of feature I always thought was weirdly missing from the Assassin. So when you use your poison option of Cunning Strike, which I'll remind you was a D6 cost option that gave a Constitution saving throw to avoid the poison condition. Now, if it fails that saving throw, it also takes 2d6 poison damage, and this damage avoids resistance to poison damage. I really like this. Obviously, if you're facing something immune to poison, you're not going to use the poison Cunning Strike. But if the target isn't immune, then this damage, even considering the saving throw to avoid it, probably in the long run pays off the 1d6 you sacrifice to attempt it. So basically on damage, it's a wash if you use poison. So you're just getting the opportunity to potentially poison an enemy, and you're not really paying anything for it. So it's basically going to become your standard option, unless the target is immune. And for the assassin, I really like this. And since we already essentially got the old imposter feature at level 9, this is a big buff. And then at level 17, we get Death Strike. This is similar to the old version in terms of doubling the damage and the saving throw. The big difference here is before the Death Strike only worked if the target was surprised. Now, all you have to do is hit it with a sneak attack on round 1. And since this is a flat doubling of the damage, it's not just doubling your sneak attack and weapon damage, it's also doubling any other flat bonuses, including your rogue level that you added with Assassinate. This is a huge buff. Really, really like it. You're probably going to be using Death Strike now in every single combat. So the Assassin did very, very well. Moving on to the Swashbuckler. This was generally considered a, middle of the road subclass. At 3rd level, there's no changes from the Xanathar's version. Fancy footwork is the same, allowing you to move away from a creature you attacked without provoking opportunity attacks, and Rakish Audacity is the same, providing you your charisma bonus to initiative, and you qualify for sneak attack against a target as long as you're within 5 feet of it and no other creatures are within 5 feet of you, and you don't have disadvantage on the attack. The way it works out is basically you don't have to worry about setting up your sneak attack. You pretty much always qualify for sneak attack if you are attacking in melee. The first real change, and a pretty significant one, is at 9th level with Panache. The old version used an action with a Persuasion versus Insight check to impose disadvantage for 1 minute on the target's attack on anyone except you, and they couldn't opportunity attack them either unless an ally attacked or cast a spell, or you move more than 60 feet away. You could also attempt it against a non-hostile creature to charm them for 1 minute, unless you or your allies did anything harmful to it. Now it's got some cunning strike options. Goad costs 1d6, and the target makes a wisdom saving throw, or has the same penalties as the old Panache. And Awe is 3d6, and affects each creature of your choice within 30 feet for a mass charm effect until the end of your next turn. Now, I don't know how I feel about Awe. I'm not sure when I would use it, but Goad is superior to the old version, and I would definitely use it. Though maybe I would use it with a ranged attack before a cunning action hide or something like that, because rogues aren't known to be good tanks. Overall, I would call this a buff to what wasn't a very good feature and now has some value. At 13th level, the Xanathar Swashbuckler got Elegant Maneuver. That would allow them to use a bonus action to get advantage on an acrobatics or athletics check made that turn. Not very good. Now we get Dashing Strikes, and we get more cutting strike options. Parrying Stance at 2d6, really good. You roll a d6, add it to your armor class until the start of your next turn. Not against one attack, and if you do have the shield spell, this isn't a reaction, so you could stack the bonuses. Then Invigorate is also 2d6, and you pick an ally within 30 feet, and until the end of its next turn, it adds a d6 to any attack rolls and saving throws. Now, I wouldn't use this all the time, but it is a pretty nice buff option. So with Dashing Strikes, I kind of like both of them, and yeah, buff. And then there's Master Duelist at level 17. The way this used to work is if you missed an attack, you could roll again with advantage once per short or long rest. Now, if you make a sneak attack, you can make an additional attack against the same creature as long as you're within 5 feet and no other creatures are within 5 feet of you. Now, that won't be a sneak attack, but this is going to come up a lot. I mean, considering you're basically qualifying as long as you set up Rakish Audacity, you could potentially get this every single round. And if you do get an off-turn reaction sneak attack, sometimes it might even be twice per round. So it's not a lot of damage with each instance, but it is a lot of instances. So I do consider this a buff. So again, the Swashbuckler did well, though I do wonder if they could have gotten something at level 3, because they're probably the weakest of the 4 at that level. Finally, the Thief. So huge change with Fast Hands. As some of you might recall, Fast Hands got nerfed in the last playtest, removing the use an object option, which allowed things like throwing acid or alchemist fire, for example. So now they've restored the use an object action, so the nerfing is gone, but they've also added the ability to take the magic action to use a magic item that requires that action. So let's say you have a wand of web. You can use your bonus action to cast web with the wand, and then you get your action. That's really good. So instead of fast hands being nerfed, now it's been buffed. Then second story work is mostly the same as the 2014 version. There's a little boost here where it says you can move on a ceiling without an ability check as long as you have a handhold. So a little buff there. It's a little weird though, because normally you have to make ability checks for climbing walls or ropes, even if you have a climb speed. Do you still need those ability checks? Because it seems pretty weird if climbing across a ceiling doesn't require an ability check, but climbing up a wall does. So I think this could use some rewording or some clarification. If it means that we don't have to make ability checks to climb walls or anything anymore, then it's really, really good. Then at level 9, Supreme Sneak. The 2014 Thief gave you advantage on the stealth roll if you were moving no more than half your speed. Now you get an additional Cunning Strike option. Stealth attack costs 1d6, and if you're hidden, this attack doesn't end the invisible condition as long as you end the turn behind 3/4 cover or total cover. Of course, if you miss, then you're still going to reveal yourself, but you can't apply stealth attack, so you're going to need to hit. And I think that's interesting, because if you took the Skulker feat, that protects your invisible condition if you miss, then you have this, that protects your condition if you hit, then you could basically stay hidden and keep attacking through a combat, hit or miss. And I will have to see this one in action, but it seems pretty good to me. At 13th level, there's Use Magic Device, and in the 2014 Thief, it was poorly worded, but really good. You could basically ignore all the restrictions of who could use a magic item. There were lots of questions regarding like DCs and that kind of thing, but it was a powerful feature regardless. Now, Use Magic Device allows you to attune to an extra magic item. It gives you a 1 in 6 chance of using a charged item without expending charges, and allows you to use spell scrolls. Though spells of 2nd level or higher require an Intelligence Arcana check with a DC of 10 plus the spell's level. So this is not as powerful as the old Use Magic Device, but it's still pretty good. Attunement slots by this level are stretched pretty thin, and with a little building around it, the DCs for higher spell scrolls is a non-factor. Like, consider your thief has an intelligence of 8. Then you take Arcana and Expertise in Arcana, which is easy to do with a background selection and one of your 4 expertise choices. At level 13, that would be a +9 to your check, -1 from intelligence, and +5 times 2 from proficiency and expertise. Then you add reliable talent, and you can't fail this check for any spell scroll. Pretty easy. However, this is the one case where the feature is still good, but it's probably a nerf to at least the potential of this feature. Finally, 17th level, Thief's Reflexes. This one hurt so much in the last playtest. It's kind of the ultimate rogue capstone, giving you 2 turns on the first round of combat, and in the last playtest they nerfed this to 2 bonus actions on your first turn of combat. And now it's back to the previous version. So I expect the community is going to be glad to see this. And that's all the subclasses, so pretty big buffs all around, and really the only nerf I could find was Use Magic Device for the Thief, and even that might not feel like a nerf for probably even most tables. So overall, I don't just think this is an improvement to the Rogue. This Rogue is impressive, as are the included subclasses. So let's put it to the test. I recently updated my baseline to the new Warlock, and it turned out to be pretty close to the old one. Here's both on screen. And I previously did some damage calculations for the new Fighter and the Fighter Champion, and the new Barbarian and the Berserker Barbarian. I just did like one example build at level 13 and did some calculations for that to take kind of a snapshot, one data point. Let's do the same thing for the Rogue, and we'll use level 13 as well to make them comparable. So here is a very simple Rogue build using the playtest. So the species doesn't matter. Pick what you want. I'm not going to worry about trying to increase my damage with this species. We'll just say we're going to start with a 17 dexterity. And then a first level feat. Again, doesn't matter. I would probably take something like Lucky or Tough, but I'm not going to use it to boost my DPR. Even with Lucky, I'm probably using it for things like saving throws, or saving it for saving throws, so I'm not using it to, boost my damage. Then Weapon Mastery, I've put here Short Bow and Scimitar. Now, you could take Short Sword if you want Vex. I'm going to be calculating assuming we're in melee and 2-weapon fighting. But the thing about Vex is I don't think it's nearly as good as a lot of people are saying online. A lot of people are treating it like it's going to be advantage all the time or most of the time, and it really isn't. And it's going to be really hard to calculate DPR for it. So if you see DPR calculations for Vex, take a look at the math, because here's why Vex isn't giving you advantage very often. So if you make your first attack in combat, Vex doesn't apply, because you didn't have advantage on your previous attack. It's your first attack, no advantage. Then on your second attack, I think a lot of people think, well, as long as my first attack hits, my second attack now has advantage thanks to Vex. Not necessarily. So let's say you're a rogue and you attack on the first round of combat and you hit and you deliver your sneak attack and all that stuff, and now you are set up for Vex, and then your next turn comes along, but the creature that you just hit has died in the meantime, and now you're going to move to a new target, well then Vex doesn't apply. So once again, you're attacking without advantage. And unless you know how often you're going to be switching targets, and I don't know how you would do that, there's no real way to work out DPR without making some pretty hard to make assumptions. So I'm going to try to avoid using Vex for DPR calculations as much as I can. I also don't think it's going to be nearly the effect on DPR that a lot of people think. But Scimitar is easy. Scimitar is Nick, the Nick property, which allows you to make your offhand attack, I guess. I mean, the wording is kind of convoluted at the moment. I'm hoping they fix it. But it allows you to make that offhand attack, and it doesn't use your bonus action, which frees up your cunning action, which for a rogue is really nice. Now, a rogue has no way to get 2-weapon fighting without multiclassing now, because the 2-weapon fighting style feat now has the requirement that you have a fighting style in your base class. So rogue doesn't have that, so they can't take that feat. And it also screws the monk. The monk can't get that fighting style feat either. But with the rogue, it's not such a big deal, because the purpose of that second attack is just to increase your odds of applying your sneak attack damage. That's the real benefit. And so I'll take Scimitar, assume we're using Scimitar with Nick. Then subclass, I'm going to take Assassin. That one's easy. And then level 4, we'll take the Sentinel feat. So that'll increase our dexterity to 18. And I'm going to assume that once in a while we're going to get a reaction attack because of Sentinel off turn, which does apply for sneak attack. And for the purpose of these calculations, I'm going to assume 1 every 4 rounds. That is an assumption, and you might think it's more often or less often. I'm going to use 1 out of 4. Then level 8, I'm going to take the Charger feat, and then I will use the Charger feat to do an additional D8 on my first attack on my turn, and it's going to increase my dexterity to 19. And then at level 10, I'll take Skulker. Doesn't improve my DPR, but it's fun, and it will improve my dex to 20, which actually does improve my DPR. So that's where I'm sitting with the level 13 DPR calculations. So as I mentioned, I'm doing level 13. This is just a data point. It gives us an idea. So I have done a Berserker Barbarian, and that was doing 58.3 at 13th level. Champion Fighter was doing 50.44 at that level, and I was really impressed with both those numbers, and I did videos on those. So let's see how our playtest Rogue compares, again at 13th level with this example build. So our Scimitar is doing 3.5 average damage, and then 5 from Dexterity, so that's 8.5. Then we'll do a Charge, that adds 4.5, so that's 13 damage on our first attack before Sneak Attack. I'm going to assume that we will probably have advantage on our first attack. We have Assassin, that could give us advantage, at least on round 1. Then we have Cunning Action, which would probably be most of the time how we would get advantage. So we're going to hide and then sneak out and attack. And then our first attack would have advantage. I mean, in a pinch, you could do steady aim, but that would be a last resort, because I don't like that maneuverability thing when you're fighting in melee. It works better if you're fighting at range. So I would try to use cunning action when I could. But 84% chance to hit with advantage times 13 is 10.92. Add another 0.8 because we do 8 extra damage if we score a critical. So attack 1 does 11.72 damage on average without sneak attack. Then we have Nick Attack, and we don't have 2-weapon fighting, so it's just 3.5 average damage. No advantage to hit on this one, so it's 60% times 3.5 is 2.1. 0.18 from crits, so attack 2 does 2.28 damage on average. Of course, again, the point of Nick isn't so much that 2.28 damage, which isn't very much. It's to increase our chance of hitting at least once on our turn, so we can deliver Sneak Attack, which at level 13 is 76 or 24.5. We can figure out that chance to hit at least once by multiplying our chance to miss with our first attack by our chance to miss with the second attack, and we determine our chance to miss with both attacks, which is only 6%. So we have a 94% chance of delivering Sneak Attack, and that's pretty good. The crit chance is a bit more complicated because, of course, we have a better chance to crit with the first attack, but it ends up being an 8.33% chance to crit. I'm going to round that off to 8%. So 94% times our sneak attack damage is 23.03, then 1.96 from our chance to crit, and our sneak attack delivers 24.99 damage per round. Then we have Sentinel, which I was assuming was going to give us about a 1-in-4 chance of a reaction attack, which won't have advantage or a charge, but it does add our dexterity and sneak attack. So that's 3.5 plus 5 plus 24.5, or 60% times 33, or 19.8. And then 1.4 from crit, and reaction attacks 1 out of every 4 rounds, so we divide it by 4 for 5.3. Then on round 1, we get our assassin stuff. So that's advantage on all attacks, though I'm assuming advantage on the first attack anyways, and second attack, I just don't think it's going to make much of a difference, so I'm not going to worry about the advantage. The difference is going to be pretty small, and kind of a pain in the neck to do the math. However, we should get our assassin level added to damage if we hit at least once on round 1, and there's a 97% chance we'll hit on round 1 with advantage on both attacks. So 97% times our rogue level of 13 is 12.61. I will assume about 4 rounds per combat, so we'll divide that by 4, and it's adding 3.15 DPR. So we have 11.72 from our first attack, plus 2.28 from our second attack, plus 24 from our sneak attack, plus 5.3 from our sentinel, then 3.15 from assassinate, and we are at 46.45. Our 2014 baseline is 26.55 at level 13, and our playtest baseline is 26.65. They're basically the same. We're sitting pretty. We're 74% over baseline. And to compare, we have the champion fighter here at 50.44 and the new barbarian at 58.3. So the new berserker barbarian is still the king of damage, but the fighter and rogue end up in the same neighborhood. The fighter does a little bit more. Now, remember I said that the poison cutting strike, which we get at 13th level, called envenom strikes, would basically be a wash for damage with the assassin. So we should also remember that in addition to doing this damage, we have a chance to poison our enemy, and that's basically going to be for free, as long as that enemy isn't immune to poison. And we're still at 46.45, plus a potentially poisoned enemy. So Champion Fighter doesn't get that, Berserker Barbarian doesn't get that. That's pretty strong. But what if we want to do some kind of different cunning strike? How much does a d6 of sneak attack lose for us for damage? Well, it's easy. We're giving up 3.5. Don't need to do any math for it. 3.5 for 1 die. It doesn't double on a crit because we're still only removing 1 die of damage. So if we have 7 dice of damage and we score a crit, it still only costs us 1 die to do a 1 die cunning action. Devious Strikes comes up at level 14, and we have up to 6 dice as an option with that knockout. So 1 die would put us right here at 42.95. 2 dice would put us right here at 39.45. 6 dice would put us right here at 25.45. So 6 dice actually puts us below the baseline. So if that knockout doesn't work, that's going to feel pretty bad. By the way, I should probably do monk damage, shouldn't I? So monk doesn't have advantage really built in, so they're looking at 60% chance to hit times 10.5 average damage. That's a d10 from the unarmed strike plus 5 from the dexterity is 6.3, and that's assuming they focus on dexterity. Then 5% chance to crit for 5.5 additional damage is 0.28. Then 6.58 per attack times 3 attacks on most rounds, 19.74. Here it is. That's kind of ugly. Add Flurry of Blows, we get right here, 26.32. And so the monk isn't just below baseline, it's that all these other classes are so much above baseline now, and the monk is doing less than half the damage of the barbarian, even if they use Flurry of Blows. So a couple comments in that monk video asked about using the Nick property to try to increase the damage, because monks can use weapons and get weapon mastery, only simple weapons, but Nick is one of the options. Unfortunately, selecting Nick weapon mastery doesn't really do the monk any good, and here's why. So if you want to choose Nick, you basically have these options: dagger, light hammer, sickle. They all do a d4. You don't qualify for any martial weapon proficiency, so those are your only Nick options. Now, you could say it's a free attack because, we're just doing it as an extra attack on our turn, but it's not free. You pay for it because you have to make an attack with a light weapon as part of your attack action. And if we look here, the best damage we can get is a hand axe that has a light property, and that's going to do a d6 damage instead of the d10 that our unarmed strike does. And when I say that the d4 damage is the best we're going to get with the extra attack, I mean a d4 damage, because we are not adding our dexterity because we don't qualify for the 2-weapon fighting feat for the same reason that the rogue doesn't. So we can't add anything to it. It's a d4, 2.5, and then chance to hit 60%, so it adds 1.63, but then we're losing about the same amount for not attacking with an unarmed strike and attacking with a hand axe instead as part of our attack action. So it ends up being a wash. We don't do any more damage at all. Now, that's not including subclasses, but there's not a lot of damage boosts for subclasses. But, the Shadow Monk can get advantage, at least, right? And advantage does help. So that 19.74 base monk damage would go up to about the baseline if you add advantage. And then the monk with Flurry of Blows ends up being a little over 30, still well below the rogue. So even with Flurry of Blows and a Shadow Monk and advantage, you still aren't matching any of the other classes in terms of damage. Not even close. Now, I really don't want to dwell on the monk because it's a depressing topic. I just thought I should probably compare it to what we see with the rogue, and it's bad. But the rogue does pretty well. Does a little bit less damage than the fighter or the barbarian in the playtest can do, but it's close, and it's delivering all these other status effects, and it can use them and still deliver well over baseline damage. That's great. So this new rogue, I'm all for it. I think it's a terrific change to the playtest rogue that we saw before, and so happy to see it. So I will be back talking about all the other classes in this playtest document, and some of them did really well as well. So I'll be talking about those in the weeks to come. I hope you'll join me. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. It's my patrons who allow me to do this full-time, so I just want to thank... today I'm specifically going to thank my mage-level patrons. So thank you so much. Hey, Mr. Wonderful, Babrak, Blue Wolf, Blue Eyes White 7, Condor, John D, Descarpus 9, El Conquistadorito, Eric H, Falcon Neal, Glenn Wilson, Jared Huberger, John Wayne, Joseph Hall, Joseph Robideau, Joseph Rogers, Joshua Doring, Wu Carl Kong, Lila Corpsegrave, Magatu, Lone Pilgrim, Maddie, Michael Geyer, new patron. Thanks so much, Michael. Michael Michelle, Moxie, Nemo, Paul Suzak, Prometheo NTG, Perch Thunder, Reichenstall, Ryan Wilmot, Samwise, Shane and Todd Beyond, Earshine, The Noam Chomsky, Third, Valentin, and Wade. Thanks so much to all of you and all my patrons.